And as we segue into the object as companion with Sanford Biggers and Ingrid Schaffner. So I will briefly introduce them as they come up here to take their place at the table. So Sanford Biggers is a LA native who lives and works here in New York City. And you'll see in a moment, but he creates artworks that integrate film and video installation, sculpture, drawing, music, and performance. And as he puts it, which I like very much because it reminds me of what we try to do at the university when we're successful, which is not all the time, he intentionally complicates issues such as hip-hop, Buddhism, politics, identity, and art history in order to offer new perspectives and associations for established symbols. He's had a lot of exhibits and shows, which you can read about more in detail in the program, including at the Brooklyn Museum, Mass MoCA, and the Tate in Britain, Tate Modern, the Whitney Studio Museum up in Harlem, Yerba Buena Center, and very impressive list there. Ingrid Schaffner is the senior curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's known, I'm sure, to some of you also because she helped co-curate a show with Karen Coney, the Puppet Show. And recently, among many other shows that she's done, she did the Myra Kalman retrospective, which some of you may have seen in its various stops. And she's also done a show which I think connects very much to objects called Deep Storage, and is currently working on a survey of the work of Jason Rhodes for this current, for next fall, right, fall 2013. So I'm very proud to present you Sanford Biggers and Ingrid Schaffner.
Thank you. Go up there first.
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to make some remarks before Sanford and I embark on our conversation. Maybe we want to do jumping jacks first, though. You're all like cold and... Okay. So I'm going to begin by confessing that when Karen initially invited me to be part of today's conference, I politely, adamantly refused because I had no idea what on earth she was talking about, the comradely object. Yet here I am with Sanford, comrade in arms, having both been persuaded that a conversation about the object as companion can only be a friendly one. Sanford, and also when Karen told me that she was inviting you to co-present, that's when I knew I had to say yes. Having gone to Prospect 1 in 2008 in New Orleans, your installation Blossom, which I hope you're going to show some images of, it's a sort of great Laocoon of a sculpture of a tree with the trunks and the limbs of this tree embracing and really wrestling with the body of a grand piano. And the piano is playing the tune of Strange Fruit, and it's a player piano. Yes, yes. It's this completely haunting object that still resonates, especially as does the tragedy New Orleans post-Katrina, still resonate today, continue to play on. So your work is emblematic. I'm a great fan, and Karen apparently divined in pairing us for this panel that we both share faith in objects. So let's see where the conversation leads us. So I'm going to make some remarks about my own work as a curator before Sanford and I talk. And I took our charge, our précis, very literally, so I'm going to read to you what we're supposed to talk about. How do things keep us company? In what sense might we think of objects as collaborators, interlocutors, friends? Can things lend a friendly ear, helping us to recognize, articulate, and realize our aims and desires? Or do they threaten always to produce artificial aims and desires in us? Can art enact a transformation of the consumer object from false friend to fellow traveler? Baffled by these questions, what immediately came to mind was my rock. What do I point at?
Let's see.
my rock. So how do things keep us company? I've had this rock since I was 5 years old, longer than any friend. It comes from Lake Erie, Pennsylvania, and I colored on it on both sides in crayon. And it still remains to remind me of a memory that I had of a family vacation, and almost, in my memory anyways, was sort of this primordial bliss of a paradise on the Great Lake with these clay shores. We were eating lunch in our bathing suits in this rustic cabin. My mother's recollection is of something far less paradisiacal. The lake was polluted. There were dead fish and slimy gray clay embankments, and we stayed in a disgusting motel. So I don't know if this rock is now a false friend or a true companion, but in any case, it sits on a bookshelf. It's part of my daily landscape. In other words, I hardly ever notice it. And when I went to get it to take this picture, I saw, for what really seemed like the first time, believe it or not, but I'd scribbled a face on the rock. You see it there? Around this little mouth. So clearly it was speaking to me through this little mouth. See it there? Okay, so what's it saying? And it's, oh my God, because it's sitting on my bookshelf, it's quoting Susan Stewart from her book on longing, this passage on souvenirs, where she writes, "Thus, while the personal memento is of little material worth, it is of great worth to its possessor because of its connections to biography and its place in constituting the notion of the individual life and of the self's capacity to generate worthiness." In other words, as memento or souvenir, this rock has a lot to say to me, but very little to say to you. Unlike these rocks, which, as it happens, also began as souvenirs. I think there's 10 of them, that the artist via Salmans picked up and kept because they were beautiful and they reminded her of the desert. And she transformed the 10 rocks by copying them into painted bronze sculptures into a work of art that broadcasts more public cultural meanings and associations into an object that speaks to other objects, like this object. So for instance, I look at via Salmans rocks and I think of them forming on the tailings of the land arts movement, and I think how much more discreetly Via's work speaks about the sublime and time and ecological conditions. And Via Salmans herself said that when she was making her rocks, these originals and copies, her idea was originally to put them back in the desert, so to put the bronze and the mineral rocks back in the desert. Imagine somebody would be so delighted to find and discover them there. But then after she poured 5 years into the effort of creating the copies, she said she calls them records of concentrated looking, that just putting them back in the desert would be a huge waste of her time. So what's the delight in trompe l'oeil, in illusion, if no one hears it clapping? So listening to objects, like listening to friends, can be boring sometimes. They tell you the same old story for the 1000th time, but because you love them, you listen, and maybe you pick up some new detail for the first time, or perhaps you weren't completely paying attention, and you misconstrue something that they were saying in a way that turns out to be productive or funny for you. For instance, I'm looking at this work by the Dutch-British still life painter, Edward Collier, and it makes me think of the Collier brothers. Those New York hoarders who were buried alive in their New York home under 136 tons of stuff, including 14 grand pianos, and for whom one of the extreme maladies of consumer culture has been named Collierism. And apparently part of the psychosis of having this malady is an empathy with objects. Hoarders hear plastic bags, for instance, say, "Spare me," and then they can't throw them away because they're friends. And alas, I'm embarrassed to say that, and I hope with a dose of healthy recognition here, that I recognize that voice. Objects speak to me. I can totally relate to something that the artist Fred Wilson said when he said, "I actually fear collecting now because most objects and images scream out to me to be understood. I want to save them, to commune with them, to have them all." Fortunately, not unlike Fred, I myself I'm saved by my profession. I hear things calling to me, but my calling as a curator requires me to commune with objects for a living, and I'm going to show a few installation views of past exhibitions by way of some examples, starting with this exhibition called Pictures, Patents, Monkeys, More on Collecting. This is the show that Fred's work was in, and his quote comes from the catalog. And what collector is not a little bit of a hoarder? The show looked at collecting through objects of personal passion, like these sock monkeys, public record, and artistic expression. And the installation shows, I think, perhaps why I'm here today, because it's typical of my work as a curator, one who's deeply attuned to listening to what objects have to say, both to one another, and let them speak for themselves. And because I enjoy these conversations, I like to amp it up and create these real sort of noisy cocktail parties, putting different scales of work, mediums, kinds of work together by showing archives and documents, by mixing past and present moments as conjured by things. So constructed for you viewers, I want these connections and associations to be absorbing and accessible, no reification necessary. So the puppet show, for instance, presented sculptures that literally, figuratively, looked like puppets, works by Anne Shu and Louise Bourgeois. Next one is like this work by Mike Kelly, this tabletop sculpture that only metaphorically related to puppets through the issues of miniaturization, manipulation, power and control that they embody. And you entered this exhibition through this chamber or backstage area that functioned as I thought of it as a didactical association machine, sort of like a wall text in the round, and it contained objects from the participating artists, studios, a collection of historic puppets, and miscellaneous research. And we imagined it functioning like a catalytic chamber or a little shop of horrors, depending on how you feel about puppets, for the kind of associations, ideas, memories, feelings that constitute the pleasures of interpretation, to animate the work even before you got into the exhibition proper. And I like to point out that, so this is the entry to the exhibition, and those two puppets here, you can't see them so well, but it's Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, and they were Andy Warhol's puppets that he collected. So those were Andy Warhol puppets. So perhaps this is where the productivism comes in. Because although my touchstones have always been more in line with historic surrealism than Russian constructivism, one of the questions posed to frame today's conversation spoke straight to the heart of my work. This was the question, you already heard it. Can art enact a transformation of the consumer object from false friend to fellow traveler? The answer is a resounding yes. That's what art is supposed to do, to save us from shopping. Yes, we live in a world of material objects, things, information, technology, stuff, and art is made of that stuff, but it demands a relationship from us that's altogether unlike the passive consuming and mindless downloading that's sort of a default mode of reception in late capitalist culture. More like a friend, a companion. Art objects ask for our time, for our attention, participation, generosity, intimacy, humoring, patience. And in return, these objects give us the opportunity to expand our capacity, to engage with and understand the world of so-called mass production, of industrial things, of garbage. And what more could you ask from a friend? So now I turn to my friend Sanford, and we will embark on our conversation. Thank you. So,
how's everyone doing today? It's good to see you here. You guys have gone through the long haul. Glad you're still here. Let's get involved.
be friends.
Let's be friends.
So I asked you first to call forth an object that you consider a friend or a companion. So what did you bring me?
Well, I thought about this, and I went through my studio, and I have a very complicated relationship with objects. In my home, I consider myself to be a minimalist. Everything's low profile, very austere, very sparse. In my studio, I'm an accumulator. I have things that I've held on to as long as 20 years, 25 years, 5 years, things that I have no reason for even keeping. They've traveled from multiple states, multiple countries, and I still have them. And then in my storage, I'm a hoarder. So it's a very complicated relationship. But what I did was take a couple of clips from my studio and show you some objects. The first one being a piece that I've held on to now for around 12 years. When I first moved to New York and I moved to Harlem, a lot of the brownstones were starting to be converted and renovated, and I would walk through the streets and find the sidings and the moldings and the decorative aspects of the exterior architecture of these brownstones, and I started to collect them. I usually would do it at night because the next morning somebody would come back and take it to an antique store and sell them for thousands of dollars. So this is a set of molding, some exterior molding that I found. I have 2 or 3 other different colored versions of this that I've used in pieces finally. And I should mention that I hold on to these things thinking that one day they'll become something brilliant and magnificent, but oftentimes they just take up space. So this is one. Let's see.
So these objects can sit around and sort of be resistant.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Sometimes sometimes they sit in storage for a long time, and then I go back and revisit them and bring them into the studio, and then they sit in the studio and they mock me, and then I have to put them back. This one right here, I picked this up in Baltimore at a military surplus store in 1996. There are 3 pieces like this, this long surveying measurement piece. Below that is the letter O, to take you back to Sesame Street. That's the letter O from a neon light with the innards taken out. And to the left of that is also something I picked up in an antique shop in Baltimore. And this right here is a new friend. I just got that in Aspen earlier this summer. It's a candle chandelier. And this I picked up in Indonesia, probably mid-90s. A little trinket, a piece of kitsch to take home. And this is from Japan, a Tibetan mudra, and I picked this up probably 1990. And now you see it resting on top of the Harlem architecture, so maybe something is happening. These are moments when things might actually happen.
So you stack them up in the studio and they begin to maybe compose themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about the kind of threshold that they cross when they sort of become, I guess, yours?
Yeah, the interesting thing is, though they sit around for months, maybe even years, I find that they actually articulate themselves into pieces when I'm crushed up against a deadline. Mm-hmm. So for example, there might be a show happening next week and I have nothing for it. So I'll go in, I'm like, let me move these things around, and all of a sudden like, oh, there it is. Mm-hmm. But I liken that to jazz improvisation and the notion that you have a standard. The standard in this case being the objects, and at some point you do your interpretation, your rearranging and remixing of that standard and create a new work. So it sort of works like that for me. I can't really set out and plan it so well. It is a very spontaneous and intuitive process.
You came to art through music,
Mm-hmm.
and you practice Buddhism?
Yeah, I practicing Buddhism.
You practice Buddhism. Maybe I'm being too simplistic here, but I wonder if, so I think of Buddhism and the world of shadows and sound and who needs all these things. So do you have a maybe sort of complicated, or maybe that makes you more attuned to what objects can do or say?
Well, I lived in Japan for around 3 years in the early 90s, and that's when I sort of embarked on studying Buddhism and Shinto and Taoism and so on. And from my understanding of it, it's not so much that the thing and the object is bad in and of itself, but it's our desire and our fetishization of that object that creates desire and ultimately pain. That's why in my home I have nothing in it. I don't even have my own artwork in it. I go to my studio for the pain. So with that in mind, let's see. I vacillate between the thing and that desire to have an object and make an object, and then doing things that aren't actually objects but experiences, and they are ephemeral. I'm showing this piece right here because it speaks very directly to Buddhism. This is essentially a mandala made out of hand-carved floor tiles. And though it exists as an object right here, what you can't see in this picture are the scuff marks that are all on this floor, which I also use as a dance floor for breakdance contests. So for me, the real action, the real thing, if you will, is really this. But this was a one-time event. So when you see this afterwards, it's merely a remnant or a repository of what happened before. So for me, that's my way of having my cake and eating it too, is that I have the object, but I also have this ephemeral gesture, this thing that has happened before, that if you're very attuned and you walk on it or you're in its presence, you can see that these scuff marks are alluding to a past experience or promoting you going on that floor and dancing yourself.
So things as props or things as stages, and then existing in different manifestations or stages.
Well, I think objects, you know, as you mentioned earlier, objects do sometimes object to being merely objectified. They want to perform. They want to assert themselves sometimes. And I think that's really what the thing is for me, is the interaction between the viewer and the object, and who is really provoking, which one is provoking the other.
So for yourself, did you come to being an artist through things? Through objects, or?
Actually, I came to making art, as you mentioned, through music. I was teaching myself, basically learning how to play piano by ear and playing with my brother's band. He's 9 years older than me, and sitting down listening to the radio and picking up songs as I heard them. But then when I gradually started to listen to jazz, I couldn't play it. I was around 13, 14. I couldn't understand what was going on. So I started to paint pictures of the people who were playing the music. So it was my way of somehow being still musically involved, even though it was an artistic pursuit. At the same time that was happening, that would be the object, of course. The same time that was happening, I was sneaking out of my parents' house and spray painting throughout the streets of LA, which of course is an ephemeral thing because it can be erased the next morning. So, and it was really about the act of going out there and doing it as much as it was leaving something up. It was more so about the act, the risk, the danger, that kind of, you know, subversive lifestyle. So it was a little bit of both. I think that complicated relationship started quite early.
And okay, so I think of you so much in terms of things, but then also in terms of performance, video. So the things, I guess, are sort of can't think of the word. There's sort of pivots for you. Okay. Did you bring a picture of your studio?
Yeah, that's fine. There should be something.
Goodness, maybe you should just.
Wait, these are. You know, I didn't bring just straight ahead pictures of the studio, but you could see this is what I took last night, just walking through the studio. These are accumulations. These are 8-ball jackets. You asked me a little bit about where do I find my friends, and if I buy my friends or if they find me. Yeah, sometimes I buy my friends, typically on eBay these days. Prior to that, I used to do a lot of dumpster diving when I lived in Baltimore or Virginia or places that were a little bit more conducive to riding around and throwing something in a truck. But when I moved here, that process changed, so I had to resort to eBay or online vendors and so on, which is good in some ways because it could cut the chase down, but you don't have that sense of discovery, which is obviously a very tactile object, thing-related moment when you see that thing peeking at you behind, you know, some dusty blanket, and you're like, oh wait, that's calling me, I need that thing right there. So the experience is very different. It's a little bit more directed, but less explorative.
What about?
Oh, I just found her. I found her around 2 months ago on the Upper West Side behind a trash bin.
And she's just sort of lurking in your studio now.
Yeah, well, I juxtaposed her with a photograph right here on the bottom that I've had laying around too. So it was one of those moments when I was about to leave my studio and I was like, let me just combine two things and see if something happens. So,
What about things finding you and inheriting things, or people giving you things, or things, I guess, sort of staking a claim, maybe you don't even want them, but they come to you because somehow they've been identified with you?
I find those to be, right now, since I have resorted to buying things online, if things are gifted to me or donated to me, those often have a lot more resonance, more of a personal mystery or magical experience related to them. This right here, this is part of a series that I've been doing lately of repurposed pre-Civil War quilts. And this came about years ago when I was took some quilts that I found on eBay and I started spray painting and drawing directly on the quilts. And a woman was visiting my studio, and it turns out that she is a descendant of Andrew Jackson, and her family has held on to these pre-Civil War quilts for many, many years. And she asked me if I wanted a few, and she gave me 10. And this was, a very strong moment because I'd been doing research on quilts, and though it has been contested back and forth in terms of history and art history, there is a notion that these quilts were often used on the Underground Railroad as signposts. So as escaping slaves would be traveling from the south to the north, and they would arrive at a safe house, there may be a quilt on the outside, hung a certain way, folded a certain way, or a certain type of pattern that would relay whether or not it was safe to stay there or if they were under surveillance and should keep moving. So with that in mind, and also thinking about Harriet Tubman, reading the stars, so essentially being an astronaut, I started doing star maps and charts directly on the quilts. And when this woman gave me 10 of these pre-Civil War quilts, the history was already embedded right in there. So that's one of those moments where I could never have found those things. I could never have afforded those things. But somehow she ended up in my studio. The objects resonated with her. She had more objects to donate.
Okay, so Sanford, here's this pre-Civil War quilt in your
Oh,
studio.
there's a studio shot. I got a studio shot. There we go.
And you're aiming the spray paint at it. Is there like a moment where the thing speaks to you and says, no, or go?
Absolutely. There's some failed attempts laying around the studio for sure. But I sit with these up on the walls or folded up or around me for months at a time. And then, once again, there's that moment when it's like, okay, this one needs a diagonal line, this one needs green, this one needs a circle, and then things start to gel and start to happen. But I think that process of defacing or embellishing these already existing works is also part of that complicated relationship of venerating the object as is, but also wanting to sort of desecrate it or change it, enhance it, modify it in some way.
Let's shift to talk about some specific objects. Do you have in there Cheshire?
I do.
Which was it seems like it could be the poster child for our talk about lady. Oh, here's Cheshire and Blossom.
Cheshire and Blossom at once. I don't know if we can pass this. It is definitely asserting itself. Okay.
I will be heard.
Oh, wait, here we go. There we go. So that's Cheshire, one of its incarnations.
Yeah, as I was saying, this could be like the poster child for our, the object as companion or friend, but
Or enemy.
Or enemy, because it's the Cheshire cat, and then it's resonates with lynching and with racist imagery, and it's a very loaded emblem in your work that's taken on many incarnations. But what did it begin with? What was the object that?
Well, this was one of those moments when a non-object had to become solid. So it really started with this video, which I hope will play. Maybe I have to hit play. Oh, I think we have to do it this way. Okay. So it actually started as a video project, a performance that I documented in San Francisco, or outside of San Francisco in the Headlands, where I invited several friends of mine to wear the clothes of their work, whatever they did, the lawyer, the accountant, the doctor, the lab technician, the fencer, the DJ, and to find random trees for each of them and ask them to climb the tree. And the common common denominator where all the guys were either African or African American, and climbing the tree became the metaphor for assimilation or sort of triumphing over trial. And ultimately, they would be hanging out in the tree as opposed to being hung from the tree, sitting there lazily, happily, sarcastically with a grin like the Cheshire Cat. And the Cheshire Cat, of course, becomes invisible, just like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man represents sort of these guys. So there was a triple entendre, a lot of things happening. And that was sort of a physical exercise that I later crystallized into an object form, which then became, from him attempting to climb a tree, to this light box essentially hanging in a tree. And once again, there was still some flipping going on because this picture right here was taken in Germany, and the piece is called Cheshire. So everybody who saw it immediately thought of Lewis Carroll. But when I showed it in Virginia or in Baltimore, places in the US, particularly the South, it became blackface minstrelsy. And I was interested in how loaded this visual was depending on the context of where it was, which gave the object a very insidious life and a shape-shifting ability. And then that became a billboard that was shown in Los Angeles with no context, no title, no anything behind it. And it just sort of was this weird face lurking at you, smile lurking at you. And then I did a half version, which I call a smirk. And I shine the floor directly, I polish the floor directly in front of it so that when it lights up, it becomes a full smile. And when the lights go off, it's just half of a smile. And then the original object itself. And then a plate that I made that has, if you look very closely or you squint your eyes, you'll find the Cheshire grin embedded inside of that as well. So it takes on myriad forms as it disappears and reappears.
And does it continue to reappear in the work? Is it something you continue to work?
I do, but it's changing. It's shifting again. The most recent iteration of it, if bear with me as I flip back through these slides. The most recent iteration would be, yeah, there we go. A quilt that I put it on, and then I start to erase it and pour paint over it and start to disassemble and deconstruct it.
What's this?
Oh, so you
Oh, okay.
so you asked me about objects that I might have inherited or things that have been around for a long time, and I got this from my brother. This isn't the exact one, but I found an image of it online. But this is a Kalimba or mbira that he had as a toy as a kid, which is basically a finger piano, and later was ultimately the predecessor to the piano, which I often use in my work. So that's an object that's been around for quite some time.
But it hasn't been transmogrified into a work of art. It's just a sort of...
Actually, this Kalimba itself has not, and I don't have a picture of the piece I made from Kalimba, but if anyone was at the Brooklyn Museum for my show last year, I did a piece called Kalimba, which was an upright piano that was cut in half, and then the sides flipped around from each other, and a wall built up in between the two. Now I had to do a lot of research to find this specific type of upright piano that was vertically strung. A typical piano would have would be strung diagonally. But this vertically strung piano allowed me to cut it and sever it right directly down the middle and still be able to play it. So the idea is that this wall that is the barricade between both halves of the piano can promote people sitting there and having a duet on either side of the piano but never seeing each other. So that I call the piece Kalimba, so it was derived from this ultimately. But you had a question that I thought was really interesting.
Oh, yeah?
That was, can objects turn a friendly ear?
Yeah.
And I think they can be friends, I think they can be provocateurs, I think they can be enemies, I think they can be many things. But anyone who's even slightly familiar with my work sort of knows that what I try to do is give voice and complicate and challenge, and empower those black and mournful slaves that we've been talking about all day. And I'm gonna find a piece that I think really exemplifies that. This right here is lotus, which goes back to Buddhism. Lotus blossom, symbol of wholeness and tranquility and peacefulness and all that's good in the world. But the closer you get to this one, you realize that each of the petals is a cross-section of a slave ship. So it's, once again, flipping. there's the seduction and then the repulsion. There's a realization that there's a much stronger message in this symbol that is essentially a symbol of beauty. But just like the lotus grows from the muck and mire of a pond and then blossoms into this beautiful object, this is supposed to represent the American experience coming from the same muck and mire and potentially having the same beauty.
Do you have blossom in there? Can we?
Sure. I know you guys are probably getting dizzy with all these images passing by you, but. And all those things with sound, I was going to show you and talk about performance because that is actually what I consider to be a non-object thing, but more experiential and something that rests in the mind as opposed to on the podium or in the gallery. So yeah, this is Blossom, which we've talked about a few times. I don't know why the speaker is here. I don't know how to move it, so just ignore that little speaker icon. But essentially, it's singing and playing to you right now, and I'll show you another picture that may not have that little symbol there. But it's an actual baby grand piano that's been converted into a player piano, and it's playing my own version, my improvisations based on Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. And the tree growing from it is fabricated, so it is totally artifice, but it looks astonishingly real when you see it in person. And of course, above that is the Cheshire moon, blinking and jeering and taunting.
Sam, say something about the tree, which is this extraordinary object that you created.
Well, this whole piece really came from, all of these things are signifiers. I actually think objects are placeholders, not only for desire in the Buddhist sense, but for memory and for anything that you want to project on it. I think that's why we all collect and hold on to things in the first place. And this particular object was really influenced by the Gina 6 incident that happened in Gina, Louisiana, I think around 2008, where at a mixed school in Gina, a black student wanted to sit under the tree where all the popular white kids sat. And when he approached the teacher said, "Of course, why would you ask me? Just go sit down." And he did. And the next morning, gradually the white students started to leave. And the next day, when everyone came back to school, there were nooses hanging from the tree. And then that started a bunch of events in that town that led to the arrest of several young kids, black kids that were arrested when they got in a fight with a group of white kids. The white kids attacked them and had a gun. The black kids beat them up and took the gun. The black kids were arrested because they took the gun. This is 2008 in our country. So anyway, this was sort of an object that I think tells that story in a way. Rather than having a body, you have the piano that's telling the story. But this is also, once again, a reference to Buddhism, where of course the Buddha finds enlightenment under a tree. And so, trying to find a way to make sense of the world we live in, I guess. Let's see. There's a picture of Kalimba in the back, by the way. So that's half of the piano with the wall behind it. And that's just other angles of Blossom.
But the tree itself, it's a resin tree that, did you make it in your studio?
I made it, I made it on site in Kansas City at a place called Grand Arts. Mm-hmm. And the infrastructure are actually large steel tubes and various sizes that would fit into each other and taper to make the trunk system and the branches. And then that would be covered with wire mesh, expandable foam that we would rasp and sand down to create and articulate the tree. And then we made stamps from a real tree, used a two-part epoxy called zoopoxy, and then used our stamps directly on the zoopoxy to create the texture of a tree. The leaves are silk leaves that were imported from China. So it's complicated. But it all breaks down into a nice compact necklace.
Travels well?
Travels well.
Is there an object you wish you'd never met?
This one's a little tricky. This one.
Or made?
This was one of those things, it was an idea, a little bit of a joke, and I decided to realize it in larger-than-life form. But I had an Afro pick, you know, one of the 1960s, 1970s Afro picks with the fist on it. And I was like, what if that was a headboard? And I was thinking about pimp culture and exploitation and sexploitation and fetishism of the black body and all these different ideas. So I figured that I would make a king-size functional bed with an Afro pick as a headboard, simulated silk sheets and a simulated faux fur comforter to go over it. So this is the back side, which essentially looks like the comb would if it stuck out of your Afro properly. And I mentioned it was fully functional because at the opening of the show, I had some friends who offered to perform on this bed while the exhibition was taking place. And needless to say, it got a lot of attention. What most people don't realize, however, is that this black covering, which looks sort of like metal from here, is actually leather. So when you walk up to this, you really smell the leather coming off of it, and people start to rub on it, which then again looks quite strange when you're like 30 feet away and somebody's like rubbing this thing. And yeah, so it was a little freaky. And I didn't realize the impact, the visual impact it would have at that size until it was constructed and we were putting it together, and I stood back and I was like, oh my God, did I really want to say all that? But oddly enough, somebody purchased it right there the next day, which I think is weirder, says a lot weirder stuff about them than me. So
are you doing a whole line of?
Oh yeah, different colors, different sizes. There's the waterbed versions, there's the coin-op version, the Tempur-Pedic for all of you who are very conscious about your, symmetry.
Let's see. So actually, that leads to, in the sort of transformation from object in your studio into work of art, an object loses some accessibility or tactility, and certainly you have to forfeit a relationship that you had with it to a public, a purchaser, a collector. Is there something?
Do I feel like I lose something from that? Actually, I don't. I look at, I forgot who said it. It was just said in the last hour and a half or so that these objects sort of have their own trajectory. I think I have a limited amount of time with them. That was when we were talking about the arrowheads and that they'll have a life long after us. This, many of these objects will have a life beyond me. I had some time with them. That's all it really is. And I might have put my imprint on it, but as it goes out, the next person who lives with it or does whatever they do with it, it's on them now. So that's their time with it. And I think it's sort of an unfolding story. I don't think what I do to an object is the last step. In fact, I don't even think my artwork even lives until it is in front of a viewer. Otherwise, it's just sort of in a vacuum and in my head. Things get activated. They get charged when other people put on their experiences, their beliefs, their psychology, their issues with the work, and so on. That's when the work starts to live.
So maybe in the spirit of the work starting to live, we can open up the question to see if there's questions here from others. There's a question in the back row. Do you need the microphone?
I encountered one of your quilts last night at
Uptown?
Red Rooster, where it is performing as part of the backdrop of a really fascinating scene. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more. I come from a theater background, and so I was really interested in
A what
theater
background?
background and performance background, and I was really interested in what you said about objects as remnants and objects that desire to gesture or perform, and that they are often standing in as placeholders for a memory of something that was an event or something more ephemeral. So I wondered if you could just speak a bit more about the relationship between performance and object in your work, and how things like your quilts in their afterlife, after they leave your hands, can kind of become actors in an environment in a whole other manner. Thank you.
Sure.
Can you say, though, what's the quilt doing at the Red Rooster that's
Okay.
So captivating.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, the Red Rooster is a very, very hot restaurant uptown in Harlem that is owned by celebrity chef Marcus Samuelsson. And it probably, I would say, is the restaurant that has sort of reinvigorated Harlem as a hub for downtowners, uptowners, suburbanites, and so on. So it is an international mecca, and it is insane. It's very hard to get a reservation there. The mixture of people you'll see there, you do not find anywhere else in Manhattan. And, you know, one night you might see Sting, the next night it might be Brooke Shields, the next night it might be Bill Clinton, or it could just be homie down the street wearing his pimp hat. They're all there, they're all hanging out, they're all having a drink. And so it's a really nice sort of melting pot, I guess, for lack of a better word. And Marcus and I are very, very good friends. He's collected my work for years, but we've known each other for almost 15 or 20 years now. So when he was developing the place, he brought me in as a consultant and wanted me to help design aspects of it, but also to give work there. And so the space where you saw my quilts, in fact, I think I have, well, I rotate quilts from that space probably 2 or 3 times a year. So as one quilt needs to go to a show, I put another quilt in. And the idea is that it sort of has that hodgepodge of ideas that he wants to sort of represent in his establishment, in his cooking, which is part Swedish, part Ethiopian, part soul food. And the mixture of people there, the notion of this American quilt, and then me doing these Japanese and Tibetan graphics on top of that, and then spray paint, sort of has that amalgam that I think he's interested in. And it plays, you know, it really feels like almost a stage setting, a backdrop for some of the activity there. But to further expound on your question, I think that objects do promote performance by the viewer and sometimes perform on their own. In this case, I just pulled this up. This was also done in Harlem around 2005. This is 20 feet by 40 feet, and it's all colored sand poured directly on the floor with no glue. So if you sneeze, this thing is gone. And I show this because it's very much an object, but it's an ephemeral object. Everyone who came there for the opening, which was probably 200, 250 people, saw this piece, and of course they thought it was paint, they thought it was affixed to the floor, until one of my friends who has a 6-year-old daughter, who I guess freaked out because of the number of people there, ran straight across it. And she ran through and she like maybe smudged just a little mark on the floor, so you know it wasn't damaged really that much, plus I already had pictures, so I wasn't too worried. And the whole crowd just started, you know, they were like, they was worried and looking at me like I was gonna freak out, but you know, it's sort of built into the piece, obviously it comes from a Buddhist tradition, and the idea was that that experience, her running across it, reified, for lack of a better word, reified this as an object and solidified it in the minds of the viewers. So when they left, they realized that this was ephemera. And the big question was like, why would anyone take that long to do something so big that wouldn't stay there forever? And it's just like life. It's, you know, transitory, it passes. So this is also a stage. This is also an object that begs to be performed on, whether it be over time with wind, whether it be for this little girl to run across it, or whether it be for the 20 or 30 kids that I invited in after the show was done to sweep up and play in this like a sandbox. It is a place for performance. Let's see, I probably have another example that works like that. I like working with aspects of sound, things that reference sound or objects that don't normally have sound emitting sound. So here's a boombox, melted, obviously inoperable, but the reference, of course, is sound. So this is performing in its own way. And this is a tactile object that everybody knows. They know how heavy this thing is. They know how it would feel in their hand. They're implied in that relationship to the piece. And on a very technical level, I'm interested in theater and stage and set design and those things because they have tricks that the art world sort of goes the long way around, the long way to get to. And they have these things already like right in a handbook, like, duh, just do this, do that, do that. So I get a lot of ideas from stagehands and set designers.
Like what kind of tricks?
Let's see, what's a good example? Oh, okay, so I don't have images of it, but in that same place where the colored prayer rug was, in the back room, I recreated the set of Network. Network, that's the word, right? That's the name, right? The 70s film, yes. Now I'm mad as hell, I'm not gonna take it anymore. So I recreated 3 of the sets and then did a video reenacting 3 or 4 of the major monologues with an all African-American cast and changing the context and the companies that were raised, we weren't talking about Russia anymore. We were talking about the Middle East. We weren't talking about Xerox. We might be talking about AT&T. So it literally was a set, but it also had to endure being up for a month or so with people traveling and walking around it and so on. So I had a set designer come in and was like, how can we make this quickly? Plus I was under the gun, as these things go. So we had to make very, very quick and dirty solutions to make the piece work. This is the quilt that you're talking about. This is at the Rooster.
You discussed the difference between finding an object on the internet as opposed to finding it on the street or in an antique store. And specifically, you said that the former lacked the moment of discovery. I wondered if you could elaborate on that, because I find it fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different type of discovery. I might have a thing in mind that I want, and then I have to go through several sites to find anything that's even close to it. But it's sort of a preconceived thing, because I'm going through search engines and various ways to find it. Whereas walking to a store and literally, I think this is sort of interesting, as we're talking about black and mournful slaves, considering, and if you think about blacks being objects and things in America's past life, that would make me, in essence, a thing whisperer. So when I walk into an antique place or a junkyard or something like that, these things do talk to me. Just like you're saying, these objects speak to you. And it's really, I think it's a sense that you can find that diamond in the rough, or it finds you, and you make that connection. That is lacking when I'm typing on a keyboard and looking at a monitor. But I can find a lot of things online, so it is another thing. I do enjoy it, but it's just not the same tactile thing. It's not as magical.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, when you're talking about finding objects, going into a store, you're not always sure what you're going to find. They're going to speak to you, but it's more of you're looking for specific objects on the internet, which seems like a different relationship to the object, and thus a different relationship to the final art piece.
Yeah, it's because I might have a finished artwork or quasi-finished artwork in mind, so I'm looking for pieces to put into that artwork. Whereas when I go into a physical place, I might not have any idea of what the piece will be until an object, speaks to me, and then it's like, oh, this could happen with that. So that experience is a little different. Yeah.
Maybe it's like the difference between open and closed stacks at the library.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Sanford. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
Yay. So, I'm very familiar with your work. And what is your relationship to your students? You came to the apex of your sum total, which is your praxis, which is your brand, which is your art, and it's very clear, and I'm inspired. But how do you nurture the individuality? How are you? Also nurturing them finding their own path. Where is the line between the wisdom and the guidance and this is what it is to be a successful artist versus, follow your own path, follow your bliss? How do you command all of that in the classroom? So,
when I'm dealing with my students, right now I'm faculty at Columbia, and I'm not sure I can turn somebody into a great artist, but I can turn them into a great thinker. And I think great thinkers make great artists. And the way I like to set up the analogy to my students is that you're learning a language. We're learning the material language. It's the language of how to put items and objects together. And some phrases just work better in French. Some work better in Japanese. Some work better in German. And as a wielder of these visually linguistic devices, you have to figure out the best way to create the perfect sentence, the perfect stanza, the perfect paragraph, and then within your own voice. So that's sort of the metaphor I give them. And I expand on that through time with them, but it's really about them, finding their voice and what they want to say, and then finding the best way to say it.
I have a quick question. I think artists all make objects, most of them, right? And then primarily they're instruments or apparatuses for representation, for its signification, for another end game. So for you, does making objects have a concern of achieving a autonomy of the objects, of agency of objects? And if so, how does that imply or implicate the situation between various political kind of implications in terms of politics of gender, politics of ethnicity, politics of racial? And that was my question.
Wow, that's a good question. So let me make sure I understand. Is it possible to make an object that is totally autonomous of all these things? Is that?
Well, yeah. Would you, as an artist, would you consider it as a possibility, or is it anything?
Yeah.
Beyond the signification of an object as standing for something else?
I think once things exist in objecthood, aside from the reference and what individuals take away from it, it is sort of limited to its physicality in a sense. And for me, that's why I have the auxiliary practice of working in performance or video or other mediums, which I think aren't exactly objects, but they create experiences, and those experiences are very, very idiosyncratic to the person who receives them. And that resonates in that person as sort of an autonomous experience. So, I mean, I think I mentioned before that I do think all of these things ultimately are placeholders for experience, placeholders for dialogue. And I think that dialogue and experience can be a little bit more autonomous than the object itself, because my objects are so loaded with references that it's sort of hard for me to work in that complete abstract sense where it's just this autonomous thing. And I sometimes am dubious when artists say that it is totally autonomous, because we all have agency and agenda and whatever our personal experiences that are somehow entrapped in an object. So I think it's the limitation of being an author of anything. But how those things are perceived, I think, is a little bit more free and can be a little bit more autonomous.
One more question.
Yes, as a thing person myself, it's kind of funny to hear about people saying that things talk to us. I would have always said that things talk to us, but following what you were just saying about the autonomy of objects, obviously they are not autonomous, and the reason that they speak to us is because we recognize ourselves in them all the time, and they're loaded with history, and in a way, like the slogan, the 60s slogan about, or the 80s slogan about the personal is political, I would also say every object is necessarily political. What kind of politics might depend on where you're coming from and where you're seeing it, or what's happening at that very moment. But definitely there is no such thing as a pure or pure object. What I wanted to say, however, had more to do with this idea of found objects and the way that in the last 3 decades, found objects have become again found, because we already had this happening in the 20s and the 30s with the avant-garde, with Breton, etc. And I think that what is really interesting now is also that these found objects are object themselves of a recycling, a reelaboration that changes them and changes their status. But what really, really interests me, and one of the things that I've been hearing all day that hasn't really been pinpointed, is the relationship of objects to memory. Because underlying a lot of what has been said is this idea of memory, and it has been talked about more in terms of traces, because it's obviously a more interesting word than memory, which seems kind of old-fashioned in some strange way. But I think that the reason that many of these objects are being recuperated, recovered, recycled, and so on at this particular moment has a lot to do with the electronic era. And in response to something that our archaeologist was saying this morning about post-colonial, this idea of wanting to use objects instead of people, which I think might be part of it. I really think that part of what's going on with objects right now is that they on the one hand, they have this tangibility, this materiality that in an electronic era seems to be very diffuse. And on the other hand, we have this nostalgic relationship to objects that we couldn't have before because they weren't threatened with a disappearance. So in a funny way, all objects, whether they're mass-produced or not, have gained, as long as they're material, they have gained the aura that Benjamin talked about, only because of referring to that material reality that seems so threatened right now. So I think it's really interesting when we think of thingness, that thingness would have been absolutely unthinkable of in the 80s. A conference about even thing theory would have been a joke. Why is it plausible, and not only plausible, but even relevant right now, has a lot to do with this experience of disappearance and of a certain obsolescence of the physical that we're going on.
Well, I think it goes actually very, very far back. If you think about fetish objects and the type of veneration that was put on the physical object in ancient cultures and histories and regions, and I think it's part of our human nature to sort of imbue and invest a certain amount of faith, for lack of a better word, in the physical. Some choose a deity, some choose an object. And you're right, I think, with the proliferation of the digital age, there's a certain amount of nostalgia, but nostalgia is relative depending on what generation you're from. So what's nostalgic for us could be revelatory for someone who is 12 years old right now, but they'll have to do the research, and then that becomes a whole nother tract. But I agree with what you're saying, but I think it is a tradition, a long-standing tradition of a sort of holding and harking back to objects that have some type of use patina or some type of transformative history that we can imagine.
Right. What's interesting is that nowadays that sacrality or that sacredness is being attached to so much.
Yeah.
Practically to anyone.
Yeah.
Seems like a good place to end.
All right.
Thank you.